Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I finally finished watching season 1 of the new Fallout TV show, which it feels like I've been waiting for this my whole life because when I was a kid, I used to play Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 a lot of times. I don't remember how many, I think at least 10 times each of them. And I always thought it could be such a great movie or a TV show, but was also very skeptical, thinking it can simply not be done on a TV budget, and most likely it will just be a movie which will have to leave a lot of things out. And so I was not expecting to get what we just got, which is a pretty good adaptation and done so well visually. I do have some small complaints, a few nitpicks. We'll get into all those details, but overall it was pretty amazing and better than I ever expected. And I personally really enjoy the nostalgia factor of it because there are so many member berries, you can say, so many details from the game in this show that each time I noticed something, I was very happy about it personally. Now, if I wasn't a fan of the games, if I didn't know about the games, maybe I wouldn't enjoy this show as much, even though I do think I would have still enjoyed it simply because there is so much fun stuff in it. And I'm also glad that in this show it's basically a new story simply set in the same universe of Fallout. It's not based on any of the storylines that we already know from the games, and that's a good thing because that created more mystery and suspense. I didn't know where it was going. There were a few twists and surprises, and so it made it more fun, at least on the first viewing, to watch something that feels more fresh, even though obviously with all the similarities it was also very nostalgic. And so I enjoyed this show a lot. There's a lot of humor, a lot of comedy, kind of dark satirical comedy most of the time. And it also is very artistic. For example, a lot of things in it is kind of made in the 50s aesthetic style, even though the war happened in 2077, and yet for some reason everything looks like the 50s. And they even talk about the Reds, the communists, and all that kind of stuff. And we even have a scene of a Soviet satellite which apparently crashed somewhere in the United States. And so it's kind of an alternate future kind of thing. So there's a lot of retro futurism elements, which I personally like. And just this whole idea of a post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland in which the remains of humanity are trying to come together to make a new civilization, and with all these violent groups all over the place, and a lot of mutant monsters, and a lot of fun stuff that could actually be really horrifying. You know, if not for the humor elements, which kind of balances it out, it would be a really depressing and horrific kind of show because, there are a few horrific scenes in it that if it was played straight, if it was super realistic, then it would be really horrifying and depressing. But because it's always done with humor, that balances it out, so it's more fun to watch. Otherwise, it will be absolutely horrifying and depressing if it was all done totally realistically. It kind of reminds me of that movie called The Road, which is also about a post-apocalypse. And that movie was super realistic, and that made it really depressing and scary and kind of sad. And so, if they made Fallout like that, it would be not so enjoyable. So, I think that all the humor and comedy actually balances out all the horrific elements of it, and it makes it a much more fun ride. There's also a lot of hyper violence and gory death, but it's also done in a fun way, meaning it's very artistic, it's very interesting to see just from an artistic standpoint the way they do it. And it reminded me how I first played the Fallout game the first time without the gory death turned on, meaning whenever I killed someone in the game, he just fell down and a small puddle of blood appeared, and that's the way everyone died in the whole game. And only later on I found out you can actually activate the gory death option, and then each time you kill someone, depending on the weapon you use, they always die in horrific gory ways. And that is one of the reasons I had to play that game all over again, because then I wanted to see how everyone dies depending on which weapon I use. So I had to test every single weapon on every single type of character in the game just to see the beauty of their gory death. And maybe that makes me sound sadistic, but it was simply really interesting to see how they made it, out of some morbid curiosity to see what will happen with that person or animal that I use a plasma rifle on, or a laser rifle, or a rocket launcher. And so depending on the weapon you use, they always died in horrific ways. And so it was fun in the sense of simply artistic visual special effects. And so in the show they also do it. Maybe it's kind of too much for some people, but I just view it as part of the fun One minor complaint I have about the show's visual effects is that a lot of places just seem kind of too clean. I mean, it's supposed to be a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and yet we see a bunch of old cars or buildings from before the war, and they seem to be in a pretty good condition considering they went through a nuclear war and also 200 years have passed. And so all those cars, for example, should have nothing but maybe a skeleton remaining and not full frames with color and with paint on them. And so a lot of places felt kind of too colorful and too pretty, and things being too new if 200 years passed since the war, and also the war itself should have caused more damage. And so I know in the games they also had those kinds of junk towns with a lot of remaining things, and so maybe they were just trying to be faithful to the games and the way everything should look like. But I think I would have preferred if they added some realism, because then I wouldn't have this problem of my brain kind of thinking about these things as I'm watching and kind of taking me out of it because it's too unrealistic. Another small complaint is the vaults themselves seem to be almost out in the open. I mean, the main door of the vault was just in some small structure on the surface, accessible to anyone, and it makes me think, how come no one ever tried to break in? How come no one tried to use explosives to break through that one door that leads to the vault? And so in the games, I remember the vaults were under huge mountains, inside some cave in a mountain that wouldn't even be noticeable maybe, and with a bunch of rocks all around it. And here they show it as if it's some small structure just sitting on the surface and without any visible damage to it. And so how come no one ever tried to break in? How come the Brotherhood of Steel didn't try to break in? How come there are no other safety measures? Like, if they showed there are multiple doors leading inside, then maybe I could buy it. Maybe they should have shown that the outer door was at least attempted to be broken into, and yet it was all so clean and perfect, as if no one ever tried to break in 200 years. And so little stuff like that was annoying to me, that things that could have been done a little bit better. I was happy to see the inside of the vault, and we got to see a lot of things in it, and that was something that I always wanted to see more of, because in the games it was always just in the beginning of the game and maybe some abandoned vaults that you find later, but we didn't really get to see that much of life inside the vault, at least in the first two games, which I played a lot. And so that's something I did enjoy in the show. Another small nitpick with little details such as the Overseer's station. In the games it was always on some kind of tower that the Overseer was sitting on and controlling the vault from. Here we just have a normal looking office, and I do like how the desk is similar to the Overseer station that we saw in the games, but it's kind of disappointing that it's not as awesome. And also the whole thing about this vault we see being connected to two other vaults underground kind of made me scratch my head at first, because I kept thinking, if these vaults are connected underground, then why keep them separate at all? Why cannot they simply connect all the time and just function as one single vault? Wouldn't it make more sense if they can just easily walk from one vault to the other? Then why keep them separate at all? And they kind of explained it later on in the show with that whole conspiracy thing, but what did the citizens themselves think about it? Like, what was the explanation for it before that? For why they cannot simply open the doors underground and be connected all the time? Some other cool things that were in the games which are missing from the show is that we didn't get to see any super mutants or any death claws, and a bunch of monsters that were in the games, we didn't really see most of them. We did get to see giant cockroaches and ghouls, many of which were more deteriorated and more gross looking. But a lot of other monsters were missing, which is again understandable due to budget restraints. They couldn't do everything, so maybe in future seasons we'll get to see more of the other things. I did like some of the new details they added to the lore of Fallout, to the world building of it. For example, they showed some of the background of how the vaults were set up. It was something that I remember was mentioned in Fallout 2, that the vaults were used as some kind of social experiment on a grand scale, to kind of test humanity. So each vault had some specific defect which was deliberately designed to test the occupants of it and to make them compete with each other. And so there are a lot of things that we see from the background from before the war, and also the whole conspiracy about the cold fusion technology being deliberately withheld from humanity, which actually explains a contradiction I remember thinking about when I was playing the games, because they often show that there are all kinds of cold fusion batteries and fuel and stuff like that, and at the same time they said the war happened because petroleum ran out. And I remember thinking, if cold fusion technology is possible, then it should solve all energy needs of humanity. So why was there even a war? And they actually kind of explain it in the show that the technology existed, and yet the powers that controlled everything, and mostly those investors who were making the vaults simply to make money, to sell it to rich people to buy spots in the vaults, so they didn't want the energy crisis to end. They wanted even the war to happen simply for their own profits and simply to rule all of humanity later on. And so there was kind of a conspiracy which deliberately suppressed the cold fusion technology. So that actually explains kind of a logical contradiction. I remember even when playing the games, I was thinking about how it doesn't really make sense. And so the game actually never answered it, to my knowledge. Maybe the later games did. And so in the show, they actually explained that little contradiction, that cold fusion technology already existed, and yet it was suppressed deliberately by evil people, the same ones that kind of set up the vaults as social experiments to test people in various scenarios. And so all of that was interesting. Now, this season did not explain some of the mysteries that it itself set up. For example, what exactly happened in Vault 32. From what we saw inside that vault, it looked like the people there killed each other or went crazy or something, but the show didn't yet explain what exactly happened and why. I also like some of the backstory they added with all the flashback scenes of the Ghoul character. They show that in the past, before the war, he was actually an actor playing a cowboy, when in the far future as a ghoul he actually is kind of a cowboy. And it also added some depth to the character and showed some character development, showing the differences of him in the past and in the future. In the past he was still a moral person who, even as an actor in a movie, didn't want to just shoot someone in the head, but only to arrest him, while in the future he's the opposite. He's almost like the villain of the show. And he is, by the way, the best character probably, I think. And so I'll get to that later, but in all the flashback scenes it was also interesting the way they connected him with the origin of a lot of the Vault symbols, meaning he's the one who, they hired him as an actor to basically promote the Vaults in commercials, and he's the one who came up with the thumb up symbol, which later became the logo of the Vaults, which is again something that was never explained in the games, and here they added some new info, some new background to all of it, and I kind of liked it. And they even implied that the way that the uniforms in the Vaults look like were also based on his cowboy costume, because when he was playing a cowboy, he was kind of wearing blue and yellow outfits, and so when they designed the uniform, they gave him his colors, and so it kind of looks similar to his costume. And then he came up with the thumb up with a smile, and so that became the logo of the Vaults. And so I like how they added these little details. And there are basically three main characters. There's the Ghoul that I mentioned, there's Maximus from the Brotherhood of Steel, and there's Lucy from the Vault. And I guess also the dog. And there was also a funny scene when the dog was injured and dying, and then the Ghoul just injected him with a stim pack, and then it was immediately back on its feet like nothing happened. That really made me laugh, because that's how it was in the game, that you can heal anything if you had enough stim packs. And as I mentioned, a lot of attention to detail to the game, like there's a part when Lucy gets radiation poisoning and then is given some rad away which cures her, and so a lot of references to the games. Also, the Pip-Boy device that Vault Dwellers wear is exactly from the game, and all the different weapons, the way that Lucy starts out, they showed her skill set the same way that you pick your skills in the game, and they showed us how she trained with different things in the Vault, and then gradually she gets better and better weapons, just like you had to do in the game. And so there's a lot of fun stuff like that, which to me was very nostalgic and very fun to see. And all the scenes in the junk towns when you had to trade with other people using bottle caps as money, and we saw iguana sticks as food you can buy, and we saw the cow with two heads, and a lot of stuff directly from the game which I love to see in live action. And of course the power armor of the Brotherhood of Steel is extremely cool, and that was always a cool idea. And I think it originated in the science fiction book Starship Troopers. I think that was the first time. And in the Fallout games, you gradually get better and better armor, and that's the final one you can get, the one that you actually wear power armor. And then you obviously have better protection, and you also can carry bigger weapons, and you have a lot more storage room, since you can carry more weight. And so it was always fun to be in that suit in the game. And I remember a really funny joke in the first Fallout game when you were walking around in that suit and some kid came over and started asking you a bunch of questions. And he asked, how can you go to the toilet in that? And then you explain to him it has a filtration system that anything that leaves your body gets recycled. And then you have a little straw that you can drink from. And you explain it's a filtration system, but then the kid goes running around shouting, he drinks pee pee, he drinks pee pee. I remember that was a really funny joke. And also, somewhere randomly in the desert, you see someone in such a suit just standing still and unable to move, and there's a small oil can next to him, and you have to oil him up so he can move again. And that was probably a reference to the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz. And there's a scene in this show which reminded me of that when the power cell of the suit gets stolen and the guy gets stuck inside the suit for a long while, unable to move. So that reminded me of the Tin Man joke from the game. And so there's a lot of references like that, a lot of fun stuff from the game that was also in the show. And the power armor was pretty awesome. There were a few goofy moments when someone was flying around in that suit, kind of like Iron Man. It was a little bit too over the top, too unrealistic. But again, with all the comedy, with the show not always taking itself too seriously, I guess it's kind of okay. It's fun that way. So I like how everything looked, except for a few places which were kind of too clean when you see a bunch of cars in good condition, which makes no sense, not just because of the nuclear war, but also because 200 years have passed. So you think there will be a little bit more deterioration, a little bit more rust, and cars would not look so good after so long. But for the most part, it was visually very good. And now I want to talk about the characters in the show. So there's the ghoul I mentioned, there's all the backstory stuff from back when he was still a good guy, and all the parts in the present in which he's basically a bad guy, like he has no morality left. And I wish they would have added a little bit of a good side in him. Like there are some scenes in which he's being totally sadistic for no reason. So I wish they would have showed him a little bit of a good guy left in him. And so they kind of went almost all out of him just caring only about himself. I guess later on they said that he is searching for his family. That's what he cares about. But still, in all those situations in which he's basically abusing Lucy for no real reason, like not giving her water, spilling water on the floor, it kind of made him a little bit too sadistic. And I wish they would have shown him to have some bit of compassion left, like show him as a complex character who is mostly bad and mostly corrupted, and all of that is fine, but show some glimmer, some little bit of humanity left, and they didn't really do that, so he was kind of almost totally evil. And also the character of Maximus, who starts out as an underdog that you're kind of rooting for, but pretty quickly they also make him kind of immoral, kind of too much and too quickly. They do reveal later on that something bad that we think he did, he actually didn't do, but he did other bad things which are almost irredeemable. They did show the context of it, that we can kind of understand him and we're kind of still rooting for him a little bit. But I still think they kind of went too dark too quickly and just made him almost unsympathetic. So he's kind of a very shady character, I would say right in the middle from becoming a villain, because he's basically very selfish, he's doing bad things just for the sake of himself and betraying people who are supposed to be on his own side. And that kind of made him a bit unsympathetic, and so it's hard to like that character because of these choices. And I remember when playing the games, I myself would often make bad choices and being an evil person in the games, but it was mostly just to see what will happen, just out of curiosity. Like, whenever I was playing the game, the first time I was always being the good guy, always choosing the correct moral thing to do, because to me it just felt more natural to go that route, and only later on when I was replaying the game, then I was testing out all the evil options. But here Maximus is kind of picking all the bad choices almost right away, like betraying his own people from his own faction, and so that kind of annoyed me a little bit. It was hard to sympathize with his character when he was making such choices. Later on, he did kind of become more heroic, which I guess is kind of his character development. He kind of starts out cowardly and selfish and has to become a hero later on. So I guess in some ways it's okay. I wish they would have made it not so selfishly moral the way they made him. Acting wise, they're all great, by the way. I have no complaints against the actors. It's the writing that I have some minor nitpicks about. And now let's talk about Lucy, who is kind of the main character. And my problem with her was that she was kind of being too stupid, too gullible, and too naive. because she comes from a vault in which people help each other, they're a community, and then she goes outside and people are selfish and they're monsters, and all of that is so alien to her, which explains why she's apparently so gullible. It's part of her character development that she starts out so naive and gullible, and then she becomes more badass as she goes, simply to survive. And all of that is okay, but my problem is that she was kind of being too stupid even for that, even for someone who's a vault dweller, and they do show that all of them are like that they're all were kind of educated to be such ethical people and all of that, so they cannot handle the people of the wasteland. Even those raiders that went into their vault and killed a bunch of them, they want to rehabilitate them and make them part of their vault and to treat them kindly, and they give them good food and trying to talk with them, and don't realize there's nothing to talk with them about. They're not on the same intellectual level in any way, and yet they're trying to teach them to be better, and so it makes all of them seem kind of naive, kind of a little bit too much. Again, because it's all done with comedy and humor, I guess it makes it a little bit more okay, but it was still a little bit annoying of just how gullible they all are. And in some ways they reminded me of Starfleet officers from the old Star Trek TV shows, because Starfleet was also such a moral organization, always trying to do the right thing, even when it's endangering themselves. Like, they never fire first, they always try the diplomatic approach and that kind of attitude, and so they do something similar here, but in such an exaggerated way. It's kind of annoying. It's almost like extreme leftist people who are thinking you can solve all the problems by just turning the other cheek and all of that, not realizing when your enemy doesn't care about any of your morality and that kind of stuff. And so, if anything, the show is kind of critical and satirical of that kind of attitude of people who are so enlightened and have good intentions, but they are also kind of stupid because it will backfire on them if they actually are allowed to follow through with their ideals. And speaking of the question, is this show woke or not? I think it's not. I think the only example of that is one minor character in the Brotherhood of Steel, who apparently is neither a man or a woman. It's kind of unclear what gender that person is, and someone refers to that person as they, them, which is kind of funny. In a post-apocalyptic wasteland, why would people still care about pronouns? So that was kind of the only example of woke elements I saw in the show. I was worried a little bit in the beginning when they first introduced Lucy and showed how awesome she is at everything. At least they showed her kind of training with everything, so it just doesn't come out of the blue that she's just the best at everything. They actually show her training with weapons and martial arts while still being in the vault in the normal daily life. And also, as I mentioned later on in the show, they show that she's not all powerful, that she's not super smart or even super moral, that she does have a lot of flaws which she has to overcome. So it's not as if she's a Mary Sue kind of character. Early on I was a little bit worried they're going to go that way, especially in that scene when the gatekeeper was trying to open the door to the neighboring vault and he was having some technical trouble and was unable to do it, and suddenly Lucy comes over to him to help him. And for a few seconds I was sure they're going to do that type of scene, like in a lot of scenes of Star Trek Discovery, for example. Oftentimes in Discovery we had scenes like that of a man trying to do something and everything falls from his hands, and then some woman has to come and fix it. And so when they had that scene of the gatekeeper unable to open the door and she comes over, for a moment I thought they're going to have that kind of scene, so I was ready to roll my eyes. But then it turns out he was deliberately faking the malfunction because he actually loved her and he didn't want her to get married to someone from the other vault, which is why they were opening the door. She was supposed to meet her future husband, and he was deliberately faking the malfunction. And so I was immediately kind of relaxing. Oh, so it's not like Star Trek Discovery. They're not going that way of humiliating a male character just to make the woman seem smarter or stronger. But they did have that character of her brother who did seem kind of more cowardly and weaker than her, and so I guess they did have such an element a little bit with her brother character, but later on he did become an awesome character as well, because later on he overcame his fears and he was no longer that cowardly person we saw in the beginning. And so as long as they show someone overcoming his fears, that's, I always say, that's a sign of a true hero. Someone who does have fear but overcomes it is to me much more heroic than someone who just doesn't have any fear in the first place, which is not really realistic and not really that heroic because he doesn't have anything to overcome. So I actually ended up liking that character, but early on it did have that element of showing how much more awesome she is compared to him, because he's such a coward and such a weakling that he just hides away while she does all the fighting. So I guess there was a little bit of that element, but not nearly as much as other shows and movies of today, which always try to do that kind of thing. I hope in the next seasons of the show, which I hope there will be many of, maybe we'll get to see some bigger monsters and maybe some super mutants and Deathclaws and maybe something like the Master of the Super Mutants. We did get to see some creatures which are interesting with some Lovecraftian horror elements, like those creatures with the fingers in the mouth which we saw in the trailer. It does turn out that they're kind of mutated humans or some cross between humans and something else, and so that was interesting. So there are some horrific scenes, but they balanced it all out with all the comedy and all the silliness. But sometimes specific scenes or episodes could have worked so much better if they played it a little bit more seriously. It would have added a sense of danger and drama and tension. Instead, it was kind of goofing around a little bit too much. But still, I think the show was a lot better than I expected it to be. So it's not perfect, it has a lot of flaws, a lot of things that I think could have been done better. But overall, it was still very enjoyable to me. So I highly recommend it, and I'm really hoping the next seasons will be even better. So that's all I have to say about it for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.